Chapter 14. Benny Shumway, which explained the need for stilts, Benny being a dwarf. But what was he doing here, disguised as one of the henchmen of the Queen of the Fae? We ransomed him, didn't we? And why, not that it really mattered an awful lot, was Countess Judy calling him by his first name? Paul had never heard her use first names with anybody. "Sorry," Benny said, scrambling to his feet in such a way that he stood between Paul and the grey shapes. It's been fun, Judy, but I quit." The look of fury on Countess Judy's face was extraordinary, not just because of its ferocious intensity, but because it was there at all. Also, what did he mean, quit? This was hardly the time to be concerned about whether he had a job to go back to at J.W.W. "Bastard!" Judy spat. "You pathetic, deceitful, small bastard!" She gestured with her hands, and the grey shapes all took a step forward, perfectly in time, like soldiers on parade. Benny growled like a dog, then pulled something out of his pocket and shoved it in the face of the closest of them, who rocked back and staggered as though he'd had an aerosol squirted in his eyes. The rest of them hesitated, and Benny swung whatever it was in a wide arc. They cowered out of the way, one or two of them tripping over their feet or the hems of their colleagues' robes. Judy was screeching something, either at them or at Benny. As his arms swung back the other way, Paul caught a glint of light off the mystery object in his hand, and he recognised it. The Sea Scout badge, which he'd last seen nailed to the wall in the great hall in the top drawer of Meltz's filing cabinet. "Benny," he said, but Benny was too busy with other concerns, which was great, in fact, because the grey shapes didn't like the Sea Scout badge one little bit. Judy could swear and scream at them till she was blue in the face. The badge was worse, and they were starting to give ground, edging back a few inches at a time. How long Benny would be able to keep swinging the badge around, however, was another matter, not indefinitely in any event. Just to drive the self-evident point home, Benny tilted his head as far sideways as he could without taking his eyes off the enemy and hissed, "Piss off, Paul, for crying out loud!" Good advice, profoundly shrewd reasoning, except that Paul couldn't leave without Sophie, in which case he was going to have to take her with him, which in turn would involve picking her up and carrying her, and how exactly are you supposed to go about lifting a completely inert body? Firemen are trained to do it, and so presumably are ballet dancers and film stars. But if they'd covered it at school, it must have been on one of the days he was off sick. "Paul, you dipstick!" Benny yelled, flailing his arms like a short windmill. "Get out of here, now!" "Fine." With a quick jerky movement, like someone plunging his hand into very hot water, Paul grabbed the bedclothes and dragged them off. Then he bent over Sophie, awkwardly slid one hand behind her back and the other into the crook of her knees and tried to lift. Various components in his spine and shoulders shrieked abuse at him, and for a moment it was touch and go whether he was going to fall over. But her weight shifted in his arms. He straightened his back and staggered backwards a step or two. He had her. Now, provided he didn't drop her and he could find his way out of this place. "Oh, you're pathetic," Judy snarled. "Get out of my way." She was elbowing past the grey figures, and from somewhere or other she had produced a knife with a thin blade sharply curved. "Put that thing down, Benny," she said, "or so help me." One of the grey shapes suddenly squealed. Judy had inadvertently stuck it in the thigh with the tip of the knife. Paul couldn't quite see what was going on over the top of Sophie's head. He kept bumping his chin on it and biting his tongue, and the hair in his nose made him want to sneeze. But the slight accident must have given Benny an opportunity to make a strategic withdrawal. Fast as a rat of a drain pipe, he ducked under the neighbouring bed, scuttled his width like a spider, and straightened up running. 3 of the grey shapes fell over each other trying to follow him, and the elbow of one of them landed in Judy's solar plexus just as she was in mid-yell. Under such circumstances, it had been a sound to stop and relish. "Well, are you coming or not?" Benny panted at him, grabbing Paul's elbow with his free hand. "This way's the quickest, but mind you don't drop her, for fuck's sake. Now, come on, will you?" Sorry," Paul mumbled. By that time, Benny was yards away and making good ground, while the grey shadows were streaming towards him. Bugger, Paul thought. His arms felt like they were being wrenched messily out of their sockets. How the hell could he be expected to run, lumbered with all this weight? On the other hand, he was back in no-choice mode. He ran. Benny stopped dead, balled his left fist and thumped it into the wall. Immediately a panel shot back, revealing the entrance to a tunnel or a cave. "Move, can't you?" he roared as Paul shot past him into the opening. Then something scraped back into place and all the lights went out. "I've shot the bolt. That'll hold them for a bit." he heard Benny's voice in the dark. "But not for long. It's just a door, not a hardened steel gate. Carry on straight ahead," Benny added. "I'll follow on with the shield. Just carry on up the passage, and mind where you're putting your feet. You mustn't drop her. Understand?" "I wasn't planning to drop." Paul stumbled over something. His fingers lost their grip and he juggled, caught Sophie again just in time. Look, just slow down, can't you?" he muttered. "I'm having problems, all right." The click of Benny's tongue echoed off the roof and walls like a rifle shot. "God, you're feeble," he said. "Look, this is no bloody good. Give her to me." Yes, Paul thought, and then, "No. Actually," he said, with what little breath he had left, "I think I won't do that. I mean, I can manage, it's okay." "No, it bloody well." Something was crashing against the door behind them. Maybe it drowned out Benny's next words, or maybe he decided not to finish his sentence. "All right," he said, "but be careful. If she wakes up—" "Yes," Paul said. "What'll happen if she wakes up?" Benny didn't reply, and for what seemed like a very long time, Paul heard nothing except his own breathless wheezing and the pounding of his heart. Eventually, however, they came to a fork in the tunnel. He wouldn't have known it was there, but Benny warned him in plenty of time. By this point, Paul wasn't all that surprised to discover that Benny was so well informed about the geography of the place. "Up the left-hand spur," Benny told him. "It's only about 300 yards, and then we go right. It'll bring us out at the top of some stairs. You've got to let me carry her then. You won't be able to manage. Believe me." "Sure," Paul said. "I believe you." He had a lot to think about after that, quite apart from the practicalities of not falling over or passing out from sheer exhaustion. They were inappropriate thoughts for someone who'd just been rescued, but they wouldn't go away until a more convenient occasion. They dug their little heels in and growled at him when he tried to shoo them off. Benny was absolutely right with his directions. When he abruptly called out "stop," Paul did as he was told. A moment later he could feel a faint draught coming up at him, as though from a stairwell. "You know your way pretty well, don't you?" he said. "What's its name? Eidetic memory," Benny grunted. "Now, give her here." Paul hesitated, but even if he was right, there was no reason not to. "Right," he said, and a moment later the weight had gone from his poor abused arms and shoulders. "You got her?" "No problem," Benny replied. "Take care on the stairs. They're a bit slippery, and there's no handrail or any of that mimsy health and safety stuff." "Fine," Paul said. "And how many stairs are there?" 173. You'd know that, of course, Paul thought. He counted them as he went down, more to give him something to do than because he needed the corroboration. Actually, he said, as his feet found the level again, "you were one out. 174. "Nobody's perfect. Now 150 yards straight ahead, then we follow on round to the left, and that should bring us out directly under a manhole cover." Paul kept quiet, only sensible. After all, without Benny he'd be completely lost. Indeed, if Benny hadn't shown up like that. But Benny had to hand Sophie back to Paul while he climbed up the short ladder and pushed open the manhole cover. Light cascaded in like water flooding a submarine. Benny came down the ladder again, put Sophie over his shoulder as though she was a camera case or other small accessory, and shimmied back up again. He even reached out a hand to help Paul up. "Where are we?" Paul said, looking around. Behind him he could see a tall, spiky, bare-topped mountain set in a flat plateau of black shingle. Volcanic ash? Should have paid attention in geography, instead of doodling Klingon battle cruisers on the back cover of his exercise book. Benny said a name, but it didn't mean anything to Paul. I meant what country?" "Oh," Benny replied, "Iceland. Very remote, see? In the middle of fucking nowhere. Nobody can hear you scream. Come on, it's a long walk to where I parked the helicopter." Benny was right about that, but he didn't seem concerned about the possibility of pursuit, and if there'd been one, Benny wasn't the sort to turn a blind eye to it. That was comforting, at least. "Benny," Paul said after about an hour. "I think I know why you don't want Sophie to wake up." Longish silence. All Paul could see was half the back of Benny's head, the rest of it obscured by Sophie's hair. "Well," Benny said, "you aren't stupid. In fact, I am surprised it took you so long to figure it out." "So," Paul said, so you're the—" He couldn't say the word, but Benny laughed and said it for him. "The traitor? Yeah, that's me." "And you don't want Sophie waking up because that'd be the end of Countess Judy?" Half the back of Benny's head nodded slightly. "That's right." "Because you're in love with her?" Benny's silence was thoughtful rather than anything else.
Not sure about that any more, he said. Oh, I was once, very much so. Wouldn't have married her otherwise.
Married her?
Yup, she's my third, no, scratch that, fourth wife. I keep forgetting Tanya, because she only hung round for a week. That's right. Judy was number 4, after Tanya, but before Heidi, I think, he added after a moment. Anyway, yes, we were married. She left me, of course, but not for anybody else, which is a consolation, I guess. Actually, it isn't, but who cares?
Paul nodded, though of course Benny couldn't see. So you weren't captured by the Fae at all? You were, well, bait?
Yup.
For Ricky?
Do me a favour. For you.
It was as though Benny had momentarily lapsed from English into an obsolete dialect of Portuguese. Me? Paul repeated.
Well, naturally. You're the one she needed to get shot of, after all.
Me? Why, for God's sake?
Benny sighed. Because you were what's-her-name's boyfriend. You know, this one here. Name's on the tip of my tongue.
Sophie. But that can't be right, because she dumped me.
You reckon?
Yes, Paul snapped. It was hardly a grey area. She wrote me this letter and... he faltered. She wrote me a letter, he mumbled. Benny's laugh came out as a thunderous snort.
I don't think so, he said. You might have got a letter. It might have been in her handwriting. But I am prepared to bet you my front teeth in a simple platinum setting that Judy wrote it for reasons so obvious they're visible from orbit. All that stuff about a transfer to the Los Angeles office. You believed all that?
Well, Paul said. Yes, actually.
Good God. Anyway, that's why Judy wanted you killed. But of course, when she asked the rest of them for permission, you being partnership property and all, they said no, find someone cheaper. So she had to find some other way. First step, naturally, was getting you assigned to the heroism department, because she figured someone as monumentally feckless as you would only last 2 minutes. Benny sighed. But something went wrong there.
It did? I mean...
Yes, Benny said slowly. At the time, we thought it was dead handy, since Ricky had shoved off to try and use your door thing to find this place. It meant you'd be put in with me, and I'd have no trouble at all arranging for you to meet with a nasty accident. But...
Benny shook his head, as though he still couldn't believe it.
I just couldn't, he said. Dunno why. I mean, look at you. What's to like? But I just couldn't. So I had to go and do all the monster fighting and vampire staking all on my own, enough work for 2 people full time, while I had you swanning around the office, filling in bloody stupid forms. I kept asking myself, why am I doing this? Apart from anything else, it was getting embarrassing every time I had to go and report to Judy. Nope, not dead yet, still not dead. Wasn't all that dead last time I looked. Sorry, we'll try harder. I had to make out you were some kind of naturally gifted superhero. One look at you and the dragons and chimeras and enormous man-eating slugs just rolled over and died of fright.
Oh, Paul said.
You can bloody well say that again. Anyhow,
Benny went on, quickening his step a little.
Since that obviously wasn't working, she got a little bit anxious. That's why she had me plant the bomb in your office.
Paul nearly choked. You!
Me? Come on, Benny added scornfully. You very nearly caught me at it, remember? I practically had to throw you out the door that night. Don't know whether I was trying to do it right or not, he said thoughtfully. I mean, I made a lovely job of the arming mechanism and all that stuff. I'm a dwarf, after all. We're good with mechanical things. But I still reckon that if I was really trying to scrag you, I wouldn't have told the first goblin I met that you'd got a pound of raw liver stashed in your filing cabinet. Greedy little buggers, goblins, he added with distaste. I told him, don't you go stealing it, mind. You'll get into all sorts of trouble. Would he listen? Would he, hell as like?
I see, Paul said, and even as he said it, he knew it was something of an understatement.
Judy wasn't half pissed off about it, Benny went on. The rest of them, they're not stupid. They knew perfectly well she must have had something to do with it, but of course they couldn't say anything. Not with the amount of money she brings in for the firm every year. So she blamed me. Even then, I don't think she guessed I'd done it on purpose. Just thought I was useless. She's always made that mistake, where I'm concerned. That's when she decided killing you wasn't the right approach. You just didn't seem to want to hold still and be killed. So she dreamed up, sorry, no pun intended, she cooked up the hostage rescue scenario. sent me off to the basement and sent you to fetch me. Now that really ought to have worked. Would have worked too, if that bloody goblin hadn't stuck her oar in. See, I couldn't quite bring myself to kill you, but I had no trouble kidding myself that if you got locked up in the dungeons, that would be all right. Sooner or later, Judy would decide you weren't a threat anymore and let you go. Maybe I'd be able to persuade her, given time. Deep down, I realised that was all bull. If you ended up in the dungeons, you'd stay there till you rotted. But it wasn't the same as actually finishing you off. So that was all right. I was mad as hell when Rosie burst in and whisked you away. Anyhow, he said, there's the helicopter, look. And in case you're wondering, no, I'm not going to chuck you in the ocean halfway across the Atlantic or anything like that. No point anymore. I've blown it completely as far as Judy's concerned. No bad thing either. Incredible pair of legs, but not a very nice personality.
Paul hesitated. He could see the helicopter below them in a small hollow. He wasn't entirely sure that he wanted to get in it. We're taking Sophie, right? He said.
Benny shrugged. Well, I was assuming you'd refuse to get in without her.
Quite right. So if you deliberately crashed the helicopter into a mountain or something, Sophie'd be killed too. She'd die in her sleep.
For a moment, Paul wondered if Benny had got the point. You know what? He said. That hadn't occurred to me. Smart. But don't worry about it. I'm not the self-sacrificing type. Besides, he added, almost carelessly, my fiancé wouldn't like it. You're... Oh, didn't I mention that? I'm engaged. Again, Benny added rather superfluously. Come to think of it, that's probably why I decided to pack it all in with Judy and save you. She's quite fond of you, you see, in a motherly sort of way. It was one of the things we talked about, actually, when we were locked up together in the fake dungeon, waiting for Judy to come and let us out. Nice kids, soft-hearted, and of course, it's never exactly bad business to marry the boss's sister.
Really? Paul thought. Then he understood. Monica, he gasped, you're planning to marry my car?
Benny tutted disapprovingly. She's not your car, he said. She belongs to the firm. And anyway, you'll be better off getting the bus or the train. It saves money, trust me on that. He added, I'm the cashier, remember?
But, Paul couldn't think of a polite way to put it. She's a car, damn it, he said. Won't that, make difficulties?
Benny shrugged. I like a challenge, he said. There'll be some way to put her right again, you can bank on that. Till then, at least, I'll know I've got a significant other I can trust implicitly. Like the telly ad used to say, why can't everything in life be as reliable as a Volkswagen? Ha-ha.
As if on cue, it started to snore. Benny pulled open the helicopter door. He had to stand on tiptoe to reach a handle, and swung Sophie in as though she was a bag of shopping.
You can ride in the back with her, he said, and for crying out loud, make sure she doesn't shift about, bang her head, anything like that.
Paul looked at him. She's going to wake up sooner or later, Paul said. I won't leave her like this.
We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Benny replied. Now, if you wouldn't mind getting in, quite apart from the fact that every second we're here we're risking getting caught by Judy's people. It's perishing cold with the door wide open.
He sneezed like a cannon shot. All right, Paul said, and he scrambled in. Where are we going?
Home, Benny said with a faint sigh. Lots of things I've got to do. What sort of a fist has that dozy little tart of Judy's been making with my job, by the way? If she's mucked up my filing system, I'll wring her insubstantial bloody neck.
Actually, she seems to be handling it okay, Paul replied mildly. What was the point of her, by the way?
Plan B, Benny said. If you were in love with your childhood sweetheart, you wouldn't worry too much about what had happened to your previous bird. I wasn't keen on the idea from the start, to be honest with you. I mean, she was just too perfect, too tailor-made. Even a complete nitwit like you had to realise that. Presumably, that's what happened, he queried.
Well, partly, Paul told him. Also, the real one happened to phone me out of the blue. Or rather, someone got into her dreams and made her want to. And Paul grinned, though Benny couldn't see. He was busy with the controls. She wasn't the girl of my dreams after all.
Close but no cigar, as Bill Clinton would say.
Sort of, Paul shrugged. Come to think of it, he said, looking down at Sophie's still, pale face. The girl of my dreams isn't the girl of my dreams either.
Not sure I follow, Benny said. Not sure I can be fucked to try. Hold on tight now. I'm a bloody good pilot, but the pedals on this thing are a long way down.
Paul sniffed. By the feel of it, he'd caught Benny's cold. The same one, presumably, that had been floating around the office for weeks. Or not, because Benny had been away long enough to have got over it. If it was the office special. Did the Fae get colds? Like it mattered. Never having done much flying, Paul didn't realise quite how soporific the experience can be until it was nearly too late. He caught himself just as he was on the point of closing his eyes. Bad business that would be, when the Queen of the Fae was after him and he was in the same confined space as her at best ambivalent ex-husband. He dug his fingernails into his arm, blinked furiously, made a point of ignoring the flock of sheep that dogged his peripheral vision as they formed out to spell the words "Countess." Sleep lapped at the backs of his eyelids like the sea against a wall, gradually eroding, continually probing for a way through. It had been a long time since he'd had any proper sleep, and his adrenaline reserves were more or less played out. Sooner or later... Damn, Paul thought. But I only closed my eyes for a split second to rest them. I must wake up right now. I really have to wake up now. I shall count to 3 and then I'll wake up. It's bloody cold. Zzz. Paul was in Countess Judy's office, sitting across the desk from her. She was reading some big fat document, and he knew that he wasn't important enough to interrupt her until she'd finished. On the desk in front of him lay a strange collection of objects, a screwdriver, a pen, an old-fashioned wind-up watch that had seen better days, a Sea Scout badge and a bit of glass out of a busted flame-effect electric fire. There was also a photograph album, and since he was bored and Countess Judy didn't look like she even knew he was there, he decided to flip through it to pass the time. So he picked it up, but the pages were all hazy and fuzzy, as though he hadn't got his reading glasses on. But of course, how stupid. Paul took the lump of coloured glass and pressed it carefully into his eye socket. At once the fuzziness cleared and the photographs were as sharp as could be. The first one, taken out in the country somewhere on a bright frosty day. Sophie was sitting on a gate, wearing a red bobble hat and knitted mittens. Paul was standing beside her, holding her hand, looking at her rather than the camera. They were both laughing, and their laughter had solidified into a little cloud of white vapour, the way your breath does in winter. He knew, of course, that the picture was false. There had never been such a day. They had never had time for romantic country walks in cheerful primary-coloured knitwear, and he was prepared to bet cash money that Sophie had never owned a red bobble hat in all her life. It was a pretty image, but a plain lie. He turned the page. The second one. Paul recognised the setting as the landing beside the Rialto Bridge in Venice, because he'd portable-dored there many times during solitary lunch hours before he and Sophie got together. It was moonlight in the photo. She was sitting with him at a cafe table, with the steep span of the bridge behind them, a gondola slightly out of focus over his right shoulder. She was wearing some kind of evening thing. Paul's grasp of the technical vocabulary was vague at best. That made her bare shoulders look slim rather than bony, and seemed to drink up the moonlight and glow with it, and on her feet were high-heeled glass slippers. False, fake and phony, just like the first one. The third one had no place in an album that might fall into the hands of children or persons of a nervous disposition. The background was lush green grass, sprinkled with fat white daisies, and presumably it was meant to be warm midsummer weather, since neither of them exhibited so much as a single goose pimple. That hadn't happened either. Paul would have remembered if it had. The fourth one was even more bizarre. In the background, a golden-thatched country cottage, doorway an impenetrable entanglement of climbing roses in full bloom. Sitting in deck chairs on the lawn on either side of a small rosewood tea table, a handsome, well-preserved elderly couple watched their grandchildren playing tennis on the full-size court next to the pony paddock. Paul had to look twice before he figured out that the principals were supposed to be Sophie and himself. Then Paul realised that Countess Judy was looking at him, and had been doing so for some time. He snapped the album shut, and mumbled an apology, but she waved it aside. "Would you like to keep it?" she said. Paul shook his head. "Thanks," he replied, "but it's not real. None of that stuff happened, or else it won't happen." He sneezed. Fortunately, he had a dream handkerchief in his pocket. He even had his initials embroidered in one corner. "That could be changed," the Countess said, and a young woman stepped forward out of the shadows behind Judy's chair. Sophie, but with a blank, empty look on her face. "I'm not saying you wouldn't notice the difference," Judy said. "You'd be very conscious of it. This," she went on, flicking her thumb in the direction of the girl at her side, "is the young woman in the photographs. She'll never criticize you, belittle you, make you feel stupid or awkward. She'll never cheat on you, or get bored with you, or make demands, or stop you doing what you want to do with your life. She'll always be there for you. No whining, or complaints, or recriminations. No unfathomable mood swings. She won't expect you to be telepathic, or tell you to do something, and then yell at you because you did it. She'll appreciate you, admire you, love you till the day you die. She'll be the girl of your dreams, but her face and voice and mannerisms and everything you recognize the real thing by will be exactly the same. Judy's voice was soft as water, soothing and gentle, the way a mother's voice should be, but Paul's mother's never was. I'm sorry I tried to fob you off with that cheap, tacky Demels or Horrocks. I underestimated you, assumed you were shallow and sensitive and immature. I thought that so long as you had a girl who was prepared to love you, you'd be happy. I was very stupid, but now I can make it up to you. I can give you perfection.
Paul frowned. No thanks, he said. Judy laughed and the fake Sophie vanished.
Of course, she said. It was worth a try, I suppose. But I knew you wouldn't settle for a walking, talking, living doll. Never mind. She leaned forward slightly and folded her hands on the desk. Here's a deal, Mr. Carpenter. Give me 10 minutes to set my affairs in order. I found a replacement source, so all I have to do is vacate Ms. Pettingale and move across. I trust there are no hard feelings.
Paul wiped his dripping nose and looked at her. I've won.
She shrugged. It's no big deal, she said. I've moved before. It'll mean a day or so to adjust, but that's only a minor inconvenience, nothing more. Far more important to get matters settled before this ridiculous feud disrupts my schedule any further.
But you tried to kill me, Paul pointed out.
Yeah, so I did, Judy sighed. But you're too much trouble to kill, Mr. Carpenter. Trying to dispose of you has wasted my time and my energy, and I'm getting behind on the things I ought to be doing. My fault. When I had you posted to the heroism department, I foolishly failed to notice that you are indeed a hero, and heroes can't just be snuffed out as easily as palace guards in a swashbuckler. It's far more convenient and cost-effective for me to give in and admit defeat. Take back your girl, Mr. Carpenter, and may you both live happily ever after. As a residence, she isn't worth the effort.
Now there was a bed, the hospital type with little wheels, standing beside the desk. In it lay Sophie, the way she'd been in Judy's dormitory. As Paul watched, his eyes itching, but it was only the cold, he assured himself, she muttered something and turned restlessly in her sleep, the way she generally did just before she woke up. Very tentatively he reached out and touched her, as if to check if she was real. The shock was painful, like brushing against an electric fence. It was the same sensation he had felt when the fake Melts had tried to hold his hand. No thanks, he repeated. I think I'll stick with the real Sophie, if it's all the same to you. Quite unexpectedly, Countess Judy laughed, even clapped her hands.
Well done, Mr. Carpenter, she said cheerfully. You know, just occasionally, now and then, I can see a little tiny bit of your great uncle in you. I have to say, she added, as the bed and the most recent fake Sophie vanished, that one would have fooled most people in the trade. So I think we understand each other now, don't we?
Oink, Paul thought. Do we?
I believe so. Countess Judy leaned back in her chair and rested her chin on her fingertips. Molto elegante. Like a middle-period Sophia Loren, without that slightly bovine quality about the jawline. You're in possession right now, but dear Benny won't let you wake her up. More to the point, you may have her, but I have you, since you haven't got the stamina to stay awake. As she said it, Paul felt steel clamps snap shut around his arms, pinning him to the chair. Sorry about that, Judy said, a bit too James Bond for my taste, and scarcely original, but I can't make the effort to be subtle right now. But Paul only shook his head.
There's some reason why you can't kill me, isn't there? He said. Otherwise you'd have done it already as soon as I dozed off. And you can't lock me up in your stupid dungeon either. And these gadgets, he raised his arms, which passed through the clamps as though they weren't there, which of course they weren't. It seems to me that your effective magic's a bit of a contradiction in terms. Doesn't work on me anymore, does it?
Judy clapped her hands again, but this time slowly, and she was not smiling. Only certain very elementary procedures, the ones that don't hurt mostly. We can try the ones that do hurt, if you like, and see if they're still working.
At once, Paul felt as though all his teeth were being drilled at the same time, without anaesthetic.
Pain, you see, Judy was saying, is an effective magic in its purest form. There is no such thing as pain. It's always all in the mind. That's how it's supposed to be. A few drops of liquid or a whiff of gas puts it out of action completely, but without the drops or the gas, you can know as surely as anything that it's just electrical impulses in your nerves, and it'll still hurt enough to stop your heart or burst a blood vessel in your brain. She shook her head. If ever I have the time, I'm going to write a book about beauty and pain. They're so alike in so many ways. Neither of them really exist, but both of them are strong enough to override the strongest human mind and turn the wisest and bravest of us all into clowns. Someone who can command beauty and pain, well, they'd have all the bases covered, as we say where I come from. Don't you agree? There was only a tiny bit of Paul's mind still sticking up above the flood of pain, like Mount Ararat in the Bible. "No," he whispered, "it's bullshit, and you can't kill me or put me in your bloody coal cellar, so fuck you!" Whereupon the pain stopped, and Judy jerked back in her chair as though she'd been slapped. "How dare you talk to me like that?" she said, and Paul thought that if she had a heart, it wouldn't have been in it. "What were you planning on doing?" he asked sweetly. "Going to fire me?" He laughed. "I think I'll wake up now if you don't mind, and when I do, I'm going to wake up Sophie as well, and then you'll be finished forever, so if anyone's getting the sack..." This time the pain was in Paul's chest and left arm, presumably intended to simulate a heart attack. There was an awful lot of it, but it didn't actually hurt. It was a back projection of pain, as phony as the polystyrene rocks in the old Star Trek. "Don't bother," he said. "You're wasting time, and you haven't got a lot of it left, you know," he added thoughtfully. "Apart from that little dragon thing, and I sat on it by accident, so it doesn't really count. You'll be the first living creature I've more or less intentionally killed. I won't feel good about it, but it could be a whole lot worse, like I could have trodden on an ant or something." "You idiot." Anger and fear, and some contempt in there too. "He can't always be in there to protect you, and if you kill me, my people will hunt you down and you'll die in your sleep, and then we'll see. We're always there. As soon as the light goes out, and as soon as your eyes start to itch, just think about that, will you? You think you're tired now. You just wait when you're dying of exhaustion, because it's better than what'll happen if you shut your eyes just for a second, and when you do..." "Oh, piss off," Paul said wearily, and opened his eyes. He was in the helicopter. He was awake, and in the real world, flying through a storm in total darkness over the icy cold Atlantic Ocean, with a treacherous dwarf at the controls, and the only girl he'd ever really loved lying in a coma beside him. So that was all right. "Benny," he called out. "What? How much further?" "Search me. I'm lost." Paul grinned. Lost in a storm in total darkness over the ice-cold Atlantic Ocean. "No worries," he said cheerfully. "Wake me up when we get there. I'm going to have 40 winks." Which he proceeded to do, and dreamed about being back at school and being called up to recite a poem he hadn't learned in front of the whole class, with everybody sniggering at him. Just that. No girls, no dungeons, no grey shapes, no death threats, just humiliation, inadequacy, and ordinary stuff like that. It felt like coming home again after the war. When Paul woke up again, feeling cheerful and refreshed, bizarre enough in itself, usually when he woke up, he felt like he'd just crawled out of a sporadically cleaned toilet. They were still flying, but it was bright daylight, and through the window he could see an endless blue-grey carpet with white frilly bits. "Benny?" "It's all right. I know where we are," Benny called back. "It's not where we're supposed to be, but what the hell? If nobody ever got lost, they'd never have discovered America." "I'm not bothered," Paul sang back, and then he sneezed. He still had the cold, apparently, but it wasn't interfering significantly with his general euphoria. "It's not like I had much on for today, anyhow. No, I wanted to ask you, what are we going to do about Judy, I mean?" Silence, and then Benny sighed. "I've been thinking about that all night," he said, "and you're right. We can't leave your bit of stuff asleep for the rest of her life. We're going to have to wake her up, but first we're going to try something. You still got that watch?" "Watch? Oh, yes, watch. You know about that?" "Course I do. You think I'm stupid or something? Anyway, the idea is use the watch to make 1 second that'll last forever, and then stick Judy in it. It'll be boring as hell for her, and she won't like it, but it's got to be better than killing the bitch." Paul thought that over for a moment. "You can do that?" "No idea," Benny replied. "It's never been done before, and I wouldn't have a clue how to go about it. But Theo Van Spee might, or Mr. Wells Senior, John Wellington. But God only knows where he's buggered off to. Someone will know how to go about it. Agreed?" Paul nodded. Whatever, he said. So long as there's no risk to Sophie, you can do what you like.
You sound cheerful, Benny growled. What's got into you?
A good night's sleep, Paul replied. Does wonders for you. You should try it sometime.
Very funny.
Benny didn't sound at all amused.
I haven't been to sleep since 19... When was the year when Eddie the Eagle was in the Winter Olympics? Whenever that was.
Paul laughed, assuming it was supposed to be a joke. In mid-snigger he realised that it wasn't. But that's impossible, he said. No human being can...
Not a human being, am I? Thank God, Benny added fervently. Our lot may be on the compact side, y-axis-wise, but we can teach you tall bastards a thing or two about staying awake. No, that year, early 1980s, wasn't it? That was the year Judy dumped me, and I got the distinct impression that the land of Nod was off limits to me for the duration. I could be wrong, but it's not an area where trial and error seems a wise approach.
But Benny, Paul said quietly, if I wake Sophie up, it'll be over, won't it? You can finally get some sleep. Wouldn't that be worth it? Benny thought for a moment.
No, he said, to continue the Olympic theme, another thing we dwarves can do pretty well forever is carry a torch. We'll try it my way, or not at all. Got that?
Got it, Paul said, and sprayed the back of Benny's chair with a fine dew of nasal residue. Don't blame me, he added, reaching into his pocket and finding that the hanky had just been a dream. It's your rotten cold I've got.
Dwarfs don't get colds, Benny said airily. Now shut up while I try and land this thing.
Oh, right. What's the matter? Turbulence or something?
No, I've never done it before.
Paul said. I mean, you must have. You can't learn to fly without being taught how to land.
Who said I ever learned to fly? Benny replied. Now, I wonder what this knob here does.
It's not visible from the street, or from the air, come to that, unless you know what you're looking for. In fact, it's only there if you say the magic words in the right order and your security code is up to date. But there's a helicopter landing pad on the roof of 70 St Mary Axe, and Benny landed on it as gracefully as a mayfly settling on the petals of a rose, which meant that either he had been kidding, or he was very, very lucky.
It's all right, he called out over his shoulder, as he cut the engine. It's safe, you can come out now.
Paul uncurled slowly. You sure?
Chicken, Benny replied, leaning across and opening the passenger door. Anyway, that was the easy part. Now we've got to get to our offices without Dennis Tanner seeing. Not supposed to leave the office without telling reception. He can get really snotty about it sometimes.
Benny led the way across the roof to a trapdoor. He grabbed the iron ring and tugged, but it wouldn't move.
Bolted,
he muttered in disgust. Paul looked round. No other way off the roof that he could see. What are we going to do now? He said.
And you're the one who's supposed to be the trainee sorcerer, Benny replied. Magic. Just watch.
Benny walked up back about 15 paces, took a run up, jumped and landed with both feet together on the trapdoor. It collapsed under him and he vanished. A split second later, Paul heard a dull thump. Are you okay? He called down the hole.
Fine, replied a somewhat ragged voice from down below. Good magic, that. I learned it from some guys at a rugby club I used to belong to. Hold on, I'll get the ladder.
Getting Sophie down was a grim business. Paul was terrified of dropping her. Benny was rather more concerned about waking her up, and in the end she slithered down the last few rungs on her back until Benny was able to catch her. Fortunately, a gentle snore reassured both of them that no harm had been done.
Problem is what to do with her till we've figured out how to do the swap over,
Benny said, hoisting Sophie over his shoulder.
Not your office, it's the first place Judy'd look. Ditto mine. Strong room's out, it's perishing cold down there and she might wake up. Ricky's room maybe, but I don't trust him not to wake her, which leaves the closed file store or the women's toilet, and I'm not setting foot in there.
Why not?
Embarrassed, Benny said shortly. Closed file store, then. Good hiding place. Nobody ever goes in there unless they're daft or crazy or suicidal or they want an old file really, really, really badly. We can dump her in the weapons locker, reinforced steel door. There's only 2 keys, mine and Ricky's.
That sounded reassuring enough, though Paul had his doubts about whether any door would keep out Countess Judy and her followers. But he asked Benny if he'd mind taking off his fey grey-shaped robe and then folded it to make a pillow for Sophie.
Nah, "How sweet," Benny cooed, and mind sticking a finger down his throat, and watched while the door was closed and locked. "Right," Paul said. "Now give me the key, please." Benny looked at him for a moment, as though deciding what would be the most appropriate way to slaughter him. Then he handed the key over without another word. "Now what?" Paul asked. "I'll go and have a word with Theo Vansby, if he's in," Benny replied. "At least he may know where old Mr. Wells has got to, even if he can't do anything himself. You," he added thoughtfully, "don't know what to suggest, really. Piss off, keep out of sight, and don't talk to any strange women. You could even," he added, grinning, "do some work. You know, the stuff they pay you for." "As opposed to getting killed and eaten," Paul replied gloomily, "which is what they bought me for. You know, there are times now and then when I wonder if it wouldn't have been better off going to law school, like my mum wanted me to." Benny thought about that for a moment. "Nah," he said, "not a great deal in it, but at least this way you get to keep your self-respect." Do some work, Paul thought. Well, why not? If he could remember as far back as, the day before yesterday, Mr. Tanner had dumped a thick wad of bauxite pictures on his desk and snarled something about urgent. It was all pretty remote, but if it came to a point where allies could help him, maybe Dennis Tanner would be more inclined to be on his side if he'd just pinpointed the biggest bauxite find in the last 100 years. Crazy not to be plausible, he decided, and headed for his office. In fact, it was remarkably soothing scrying for mineral deposits in a reasonably comfortable chair, his feet up on the desk, nobody chasing him or smiling meltingly at him out of deep blue eyes, or hustling him down subterranean passages a few steps ahead of a posse of poor men's Nazgul. If only there was some way he could get out of this ghastly mess with the Fae in one piece, and save Sophie, of course. That was the bit that mattered, wasn't it? He'd quite happily take his triple vow of poverty, tedium and obedience and sit here prodding photographs with his fingertips until he was old enough to retire. None of it had been of his choosing, after all, and all that garbage about hereditary and being the chosen one who'd drive the Fae out of the real world forever was slipping away like, a dream. Paul peered down at his wrists. He'd taken off his jacket, and most of the blood had gone on his sleeves. All he could see were two very thin reddish-pink scars and a few black flakes of dried blood. Surely there'd be more to see than that if he'd actually succeeded and slashed his wrists badly enough to die. Paul sneezed and wiped his nose thoughtfully with the corner of his handkerchief. Did I die? Really? Unlikely. He ran over in his mind of all the improbable things that had happened to him since Ricky Wormtorter had come crashing in through his window. Wouldn't it make more sense if he himself had broken the window? It had a tendency to stick. Maybe he slammed it too hard trying to close it, and the splintered glass had cut his hands. Then he'd passed out from the shock and the sight of the blood, and everything since then had been hallucinations and dreams. Fine, except that if that was really what happened, Sophie wouldn't be locked away in a steel safe full of rocket launchers on the floor below, and she'd really have left him and gone to California. That, too, was rather more likely than the alternative version, but there are times when you don't want to follow the odds too slavishly. Melts, he thought, as a tingle crossed the palm of his hand, indicating the presence of bauxite beyond the dreams of avarice. He sneezed again. Had he really come within a gnat's whisker of falling in love with that? On balance, he'd rather get off with Mr. Tanner's mum. She might have little round red staring eyes and teeth you could open corned beef tins with when the little key thing broke off, but at least she was real, once you got past the outer rind of superimposed popsy. Memories, dreams, illusions, delusions. It occurred to him to wonder if there was really a stone, steel and concrete dungeon of the Fae anywhere in the world. He was inclined to doubt it, because it wasn't necessary. Any human being, but particularly a human being like Paul Carpenter, was capable of constructing a far more unbreakable prison for himself inside his own head. Hello. Paul froze, his finger between pictures. His nose was tickling again, but he fought back the impulse to sneeze. He didn't want to look up for fear of what he'd see. So you came back here, Countess Judy went on, crossing the floor until she stood over him, a shadow covering him like a gladiator's net. I couldn't believe that you would be that stupid, but I had to check. You can't hurt me, he said grimly. We've been into all this before. There's some reason, I don't know why, you can't touch me. So please, go away. She laughed. That was there, she said. This is here, and yes, I can't hex you or steal your soul while you sleep or stop your heart with a smile, but I don't need to. Hooray for basic technology, I always say. That made him change his mind and look up.
Judy di Castelbianco was grinning, something he'd never seen her do before, and in her hand she had a big, broad-bladed knife. "You wouldn't," he said. "Bet." Paul tried to get up, but the knife was ever so much more frightening even than the grey shapes or the dungeons of Grendel's Aunt. His knees gave way and he flopped back into the chair. "Your choice," she said. "Give me back the little Pettingale girl, or I'll cut your heart out, eat it, and go ask Benny. He never could say no to me, poor little darling. Where is he, by the way? I looked in at his office, but he wasn't there." "I don't know," Paul said. "Look, you can't kill me. Not really. You'll never get away with it." Countess Judy giggled. "What, do you think someone will notice that you aren't around anymore? Or notice and care? Anyhow, I've wasted enough time lately talking to you. I'm going to count to 5. 1. Paul closed his eyes. "All right," he said. "She's in the—" He got no further than that, because the door flew open, and there in the doorway was Ricky Wormtorter, still wearing his rather tattered dinner jacket and holding a large steel crossbow. "Not now, Ricky, I'm busy," Judy said, not bothering to turn around. 2. "Pack it in, Judy," Ricky said. "I know about Benny, and he won't be helping you any more. Put that knife away before you do someone an injury." Still she didn't turn. "Oh, right," she said. "And I suppose if I don't, you're going to shoot me, like I'd even notice." "Oh, no," Ricky said, moving a step to the right. "I know better than that. Adults just go straight through you. No, wouldn't even smear your lip gloss. No, like I said, Benny's no longer an option for you. So Paul here's the only one who can tell you where to go this, which is why," he went on, clicking some sort of catch on the bow, "if you don't put that knife away and go back to your office right now, I'm going to shoot him." "What?" Paul said, and his voice sounded just like Judy's, probably because she said exactly the same thing at precisely the same moment. No, please," he added. "I won't tell, promise." "It's okay," Ricky told him. "Don't worry about it. I know all about that stuff," he added with an exaggerated nod towards the photo albums on the shelf. "Mr. Dahl told me about the nosebleed. When you get there, just ask for him and he'll see you right. Then, as soon as it's safe, I'll come down and fetch you myself, I promise." Ricky was lifting the bow, squinting painstakingly down the arrow shaft for a sure aim, ever the craftsman. "I know what I'm doing," he said. "There is nothing to be concerned about, trust me." But there is," Paul shouted. "If you shoot me, I'll die, really." "Oh, don't be such a baby," said Ricky scornfully. "And keep still, won't you? These things are enough trouble without you wiggling about the place like a belly dancer." "No," Paul squealed. "You don't understand. It's not—" But before he could finish what he was saying, Judy whirled around and lunged at Ricky with the knife. Quick as a cat, he sidestepped, swung the ball back on aim, and pressed the trigger. "Any more?" Paul said, as the arrow pierced his heart and killed him.